What if the story we've been told about our past is only part of the truth? What if beneath layers of official history and institutional consensus lies a forgotten record, one buried not by time, but by deliberate choice? The human story is full of wonder. We build temples from sand and sky, we invent languages to speak to the stars, and we carry our questions like fire through the dark. But every so often, something is discovered, an artifact, a ruin, a fragment that doesn't fit. It whispers of a different past, one not neatly written into textbooks. And when it does, something strange often follows. Silence. This is a story not of ancient astronauts or wild conspiracies, but of people, scientists, curators, researchers, who quietly stepped forward to say, something was found. And then it disappeared. These stories are not easy to tell. They come from the corners of history, from locked basements in old museums and remote excavation sites far from public eyes. They're carried in the voices of insiders, some speaking from the edge of life, others risking careers. Their testimonies hint at something unsettling, that institutions charged with preserving the past sometimes choose to hide it. But why? Sometimes it's about control. An artifact that suggests an ancient civilization once thrived in a place it shouldn't have can disrupt national narratives or spiritual beliefs. A technological object found centuries before its time can spark theories that traditional academia isn't prepared to engage with. And when discoveries challenge the neat timelines of who we are and where we came from, the easier path for some is to bury them again. This series explores 10 such cases. From the Grand Canyon to the deserts of Iraq, from sunken cities off the coast of India to forbidden chambers beneath Mexico City, we'll walk through stories that begin with discovery, run into silence, and end with profound questions. We'll ask, who decides what history is worth telling? What does it mean to suppress the past? And how does this shape who we are now? This isn't a call to reject science or embrace fantasy. It's an invitation to curiosity, to listen closely to the testimonies of those who were there, to feel the weight of what it means when knowledge is hidden, not because it's false, but because it's inconvenient. In the end, this is a human story, about our hunger to know, about the gatekeepers of knowledge and the silent courage of whistleblowers, about the artifacts we've lost and the ones waiting to be found again. Welcome to a journey beneath the surface, a quiet, reflective exploration of what we've left in the shadows. This is the archaeology of silence, and it begins here. The year was 1909. The Arizona sun had turned the Grand Canyon walls a deep bronze, and somewhere along the sheer cliffs, a man named G.E. Kincaid claimed to have stumbled upon something that shouldn't have been there at all. He was on an expedition traveling down the Colorado River, but what he found wasn't just geology. High above the canyon floor, hidden behind a narrow crevice, Kincaid said he entered a vast underground cavern, a structure that seemed, by all descriptions, more like a temple than a natural cave. The Arizona Gazette published the story on its front page. Mummies, hieroglyphics, statues of gods resembling those from Egypt, copper tools and tablets etched with unknown writing, a network of rooms, corridors, even a chamber said to be the size of a cathedral. According to the article, the Smithsonian Institution was involved, with a Professor S.A. Jordan leading the excavation. Then, just as suddenly, it all vanished. The Smithsonian denied it ever happened. No record of the expedition, no Professor Jordan, and the site? The specific region described in the article is now one of the most restricted areas of the Grand Canyon, off limits to hikers, tourists, and researchers. For nearly a century, it was dismissed as either a newspaper hoax or a case of mistaken identity. Until, decades later, a man named John Turley stepped forward. He had worked in a restricted storage facility for the Smithsonian between 1962 and 1985. Near the end of his life, battling cancer, he spoke up. He described seeing sealed wooden crates marked with expedition codes dating back to 1909. When he asked about them, a senior colleague called it the Grand Canyon problem and advised him to forget he ever saw them. Years later, that same colleague admitted quietly that the boxes contained artifacts from the Kincaid site, and that they had been buried, not just literally, but institutionally. Why would an institution like the Smithsonian suppress something so extraordinary? Turley said the artifacts raised too many questions about the age of civilizations in North America, about possible contact with cultures like ancient Egypt, and about human history as a whole. If true, this wasn't just an archaeological anomaly. It was a threat to the consensus. Better, perhaps, to let it be forgotten. Today, the cave remains unverified. Independent researchers have attempted to locate it only to find locked gates, denied permits, and tight security. The Smithsonian continues to deny any involvement. The original Arizona Gazette article is still in public archives, and Turley's account, while unverifiable, lingers in the community of scholars and seekers alike. It's a quiet story, but a haunting one. Not because it proves ancient Egyptians reached Arizona, but because of the chilling possibility that someone found something that didn't fit, and we chose not to know. In the stillness of the canyon, beneath layers of earth and time, something may remain, sealed not just by rock, but by our own reluctance to face the unfamiliar. And so we ask, when discovery challenges our frameworks, what do we protect? Truth, or the comfort of a well-told story? In the heart of Iraq, beneath the dust of empires long vanished, a peculiar set of clay jars lay quietly buried. It was 1936 when Wilhelm Koenig, a German archaeologist, unearthed them near Baghdad. They were simple in appearance, ceramic vessels, each with a copper cylinder and an iron rod inside, all sealed with asphalt. To most, they looked like storage containers. But Koenig saw something else, the blueprint for a battery. He proposed an idea that seemed outrageous. These ancient objects, dated to nearly 2,000 years ago, could generate electricity when filled with an acidic solution. He believed they were used for electroplating or some unknown form of energy use. The academic world, however, was skeptical. Electricity in ancient Mesopotamia? The idea bordered on blasphemy to the accepted timeline of human innovation. Years passed, and interest in the so-called Baghdad batteries ebbed until the 1970s, when engineer Willard Gray built a replica. He added lemon juice and recorded a voltage of 1.5 volts. The batteries worked. The implications were astonishing. Why would ancient people need electricity? Was it for electroplating metals? Healing rituals? Spiritual illumination? No one could say for sure. And so, rather than pursue the mystery, institutions filed the batteries under unknown purpose, and moved on. But the story took a darker turn in 2003 during the chaos of war. The Baghdad Museum was looted. Of the 14 known batteries, 12 disappeared. Just 2 remained. Then, in 2011, Dr. Faraj Youssef, a former museum curator who had fled to Europe, published a quiet but powerful account. He claimed that years before the looting, museum officials had already removed the most pristine examples. According to Youssef, they were hidden in secure government storage, not for protection, but to avoid the questions their existence would provoke. He described how senior officials had grown increasingly uncomfortable with alternative theories about ancient technology. There was fear that acknowledging the batteries as real tools of power, literal and metaphorical, might empower fringe interpretations of history. The batteries' origins were real, he said, their age confirmed, their purpose still debated, still elusive, but deliberately obscured. Youssef's account suggested that history was being sanitized, its uncertainties swept away in favor of narratives deemed more manageable, more controllable. And in doing so, we may have abandoned one of the most profound discoveries of early human ingenuity. What were those ancient artisans doing with electrical current? Were they scientists in ways we've forgotten, or mystics tapping into a natural force we've only recently come to understand? We may never know. But the Baghdad batteries, wherever they are, still hum quietly in the background of archaeological silence. Sometimes it's not the strangeness of an artifact that unsettles us, but the knowledge that someone, somewhere, chose not to ask the next question. Tucked among the green hills of central Bosnia, near the town of Visoko, a series of large, triangular slopes rise from the earth. To most, they appear as natural landforms, just hills shaped by time and erosion, but in 2005, a man named Semir Osmanagic claimed otherwise. What he saw weren't hills, he said. They were pyramids. Not just any pyramids either. He believed these were the oldest and largest on Earth, predating Egypt by thousands of years. At first, his announcement was met with ridicule. Mainstream archaeologists dismissed the idea outright, calling the hills natural formations and Osmanagic a pseudo-archaeologist. But something unusual happened. As excavations began, a pattern started to emerge. Straight edges, right angles, and flat stone terraces that didn't seem like the work of nature. Tunnels stretched deep beneath the surface. Some of the stones appeared carved. And then, in 2008, geologist Dr. Amir Smailbegovic, who had worked on early surveys of the site, broke ranks. He stated that core samples showed signs of artificial materials, primitive concrete, human engineering. Radar scans revealed geometric structures below the surface, with patterns too regular to be explained by natural processes. According to Dr. Smailbegovic, when he prepared to publish these findings, pressure came swiftly. University officials, he said, warned him against making premature claims. Archaeological authorities in Europe told him his conclusions could damage their credibility. Even officials from Bosnia's own cultural ministry advised him to reconsider, fearing international embarrassment. Behind closed doors, incentives were offered. Funding was threatened. Eventually, he was pushed out of the project. The official position remains unchanged. European institutions maintain the formations are naturally occurring flatirons, shaped by millennia of geological forces. But Smailbegovic insists the evidence points elsewhere, that human hands were involved, and that the implications of such an ancient pyramid in Europe are simply too disruptive. Why would such a discovery be so threatening? Because it suggests that an advanced, organized civilization existed in Europe thousands of years before we thought it possible. It challenges the idea that complex societies began in the Fertile Crescent and spread outward. It reframes the origin story of Europe itself. If the Bosnian pyramids are real, they require us to rewrite the foundational timeline of Western civilization. And perhaps that's the heart of the matter. Changing history isn't just about facts. It's about identity, heritage, and pride. When those are at stake, even stones in the earth can become too dangerous to examine. Today, the site remains in limbo, dismissed by most, but still quietly excavated by volunteers and independent researchers. To some, it's a hoax. To others, a revelation buried in plain sight. Somewhere between those extremes lies a deeper truth, one we may never fully uncover until we're willing to ask not just what's under the ground, but what's standing in the way of our willingness to see it. In the sweeping plains outside Xi'an, China, where the land undulates beneath a hazy sky, satellite images reveal peculiar shapes, geometric, towering, and strangely symmetrical. To the trained eye, they look unmistakably like pyramids. Over 100 of them scatter the region. Some are massive. Yet for decades, the Chinese government insisted they were nothing more than natural hills, or, later, restricted military zones. Curious eyes were discouraged. Questions met with silence. But in 2003, a whisper broke through the wall of denial. Chen Jianli, A former Chinese archaeologist who had defected to the West published an account describing classified excavations he had participated in during the 1980s. His team, he claimed, had been assigned to study several of these pyramids in secret. What they found contradicted everything he had been taught. The structures weren't natural. Carbon dating placed some of them at over 4,500 years old, older than China's first recorded dynasties. More shocking were the artifacts found inside: tools, metalwork, and human remains that didn't align with any known Chinese culture. Some of the skeletal remains, Chen said, showed features not typically East Asian: taller frames, broader builds, and cranial traits more common to Indo-European populations. There were fragments of writing, too, symbols that didn't match early Chinese scripts. It all pointed to the same unsettling conclusion: a civilization existed here long before the Han, one that may not have been ancestrally Chinese at all. Soon after these findings surfaced within the archaeological team, the project was shut down. Chen described how researchers were forced to sign secrecy agreements. Excavation records were sealed. The pyramids were declared off-limits under the pretext of national security. When Chen defected years later, he chose to speak out, not to discredit his homeland, he said, but because the truth belonged to everyone. Why hide such discoveries? The answer, Chen suggested, lay in the story China tells about itself: a continuous, unbroken civilization rising from a singular ancestral culture. To admit that a separate, possibly unrelated society may have predated the Chinese state, perhaps even influenced it, was unthinkable to the guardians of national history. And so the pyramids remained fenced, overgrown, and silent. From above, their symmetry is impossible to ignore. Perfect lines cutting across the land, aligned with cardinal directions, echoes of an architectural mind long vanished. Yet they remain unstudied, officially unexplored. The question is not whether these structures exist, but why we're not allowed to understand them. Chen's account has never been officially addressed by the Chinese government. He was labeled a fabricator, a defector with an agenda. But he maintained his story until his death, leaving behind a legacy of curiosity and of unanswered questions. Sometimes history isn't rewritten by new discoveries. It's rewritten by silence, by the places we're not allowed to dig, and by the stories we're told not to ask about. And so the pyramids of China sit beneath layers of dust, grass, and forgetfulness, waiting for a time when truth no longer needs permission. In the murky waters off India's western coast, near the Gulf of Kambat, sonar scans in 2001 revealed something astonishing. Beneath the waves lay the outlines of a lost city, walls, grids, and regular shapes stretching across 9 square kilometers of seabed. What was once thought to be ocean floor was now, unmistakably, the imprint of human hands. The team that made the discovery belonged to India's National Institute of Ocean Technology. They were conducting a routine survey for pollution, not treasure. But what they found shifted the focus instantly. Divers retrieved pieces of pottery, beads, and even a fragment of wood. The wood was sent for dating. The result shocked everyone: 7,500 BC, nearly 9,500 years ago. This would mean an urban civilization existed in India thousands of years before the Indus Valley, long before Egypt, Sumer, or Mesopotamia. It rewrote the very foundation of Indian prehistory. Briefly, the scientific world held its breath. Then came silence. The project was paused, then abandoned. International collaborations were canceled. Funding dried up. No follow-up excavations were allowed. By 2004, the discovery had all but disappeared from academic conversation. It wasn't until 2007 that whispers began to resurface. Dr. P.N. Duved, a marine archaeologist who had worked on the original surveys, retired and finally spoke freely. He confirmed what many suspected: the government had shut the project down. The reason, he said, was not scientific doubt, but political fear. According to Dr. Duved, the dating results were real. Multiple labs confirmed the age of the wood. Other samples supported the same timeline. The evidence pointed to a sophisticated urban culture thriving during a period when, by mainstream accounts, humans were still hunter-gatherers, but the implications were too disruptive. If true, this discovery could challenge every assumption about when and where civilization began. Worse, it could fuel ideological debates, particularly in India, where questions of ancient origins are deeply intertwined with religion and nationalism. Officials, Duved said, feared the site would be used to support extreme interpretations of history, especially those pushed by nationalist groups who sought to claim a uniquely ancient and advanced Indian civilization. International scholars, too, hesitated, concerned about professional backlash for aligning with such controversial findings. So the solution was quiet containment. No further excavations, no published papers, just a slow erasure. But the city is still there, under the sea. Sonar images remain. Fragments exist in archives. And in the silence surrounding it, we hear a troubling refrain. History can be drowned, not just by water, but by fear. The Gulf of Kampat discovery raises a haunting question. What happens when truth is politically inconvenient? When history risks inflaming modern ideologies, do we protect knowledge or do we hide it? For now, that ancient city sleeps beneath the waves, its streets swallowed, its story paused. Not by nature, not by time, but by our own unwillingness to ask what came before us and who we might become if we knew. In 1513, an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis compiled a map that would puzzle historians for centuries. Drawn on gazelle skin and remarkably detailed, it depicted parts of Europe, Africa, and South America with surprising accuracy. But what truly stunned scholars was what lay at the southern edge of the parchment. There, clear and unmistakable, was the outline of Antarctica. More astonishing still, it showed the coastline not covered in ice, but as a rocky shore, with features that matched what modern radar would only discover centuries later beneath the ice sheet. Yet Antarctica wasn't officially discovered until 1820, and by then it had long been entombed in ice. In 1960, U.S. Air Force cartographers were asked to examine the map. Their conclusion was unsettling. The geography shown on the Piri Reis map, especially in the region of Queen Maud Land, matched modern seismic scans taken through miles of ice. This meant the original source maps used by Piri Reis had to be based on information gathered before the continent froze over, at least 6,000 years ago. But who could have mapped Antarctica at that time, and with what technology? Most academics dismissed the notion. Perhaps it was guesswork or misinterpretation. Better to file it under historical curiosity. That might have been the end of the story. Until 2013, when a retired U.S. Navy officer, identifying himself only as Brian, shared a memory that reignited the mystery. Brian claimed to have served on a classified mapping mission to Antarctica in the 1980s. Using ground-penetrating radar and advanced sonar, his team surveyed areas beneath the ice near Queen Maud Land, the very region shown on the Piri Reis map. What they found, he said, changed everything. Beneath the ice were geometric formations, straight lines, right angles, and what appeared to be artificial structures. At first, his team was excited, but once the data was reported, they were instructed to stop all inquiries. The radar files were classified. Team members were debriefed, sworn to secrecy. Later, Brian learned that these radar anomalies had been compared to the Piri Reis map, and the alignments were uncanny. The implication: some ancient seafaring culture had mapped Antarctica's true coastline before it was buried under ice, and those maps somehow survived long enough to reach Piri Reis in the 16th century. But if such a civilization existed, it would upend our understanding of prehistory. We'd be forced to consider the possibility of lost knowledge, cartographic precision that should have been impossible in the ancient world. So instead, silence fell. The Navy has never confirmed Brian's account. The original mission records remain classified. The anomalies beneath the ice? Still unexplored. The Peary race map continues to hang in museums and archives, surrounded by debates. Was it a fluke? An inspired composite of ancient rumors? Or a whisper from a forgotten age? Sometimes the most profound discoveries don't lie in what we see, but in what we choose not to investigate. Beneath miles of ice and behind walls of bureaucracy, the shape of a lost world may still linger, silent, waiting, and all but erased from the maps we trust. In a quiet Romanian village near the Carpathian Mountains, archaeologists made a discovery that should have reshaped our understanding of European prehistory. It was 2008, and beneath layers of soil, they uncovered a Neolithic burial site containing gold artifacts unlike anything seen from that period. Dated to around 5,500 BC, the pieces were thousands of years older than the earliest known examples of goldwork in Sumer or Egypt. The objects were delicate, finely crafted, spirals, beads, and plaques that shimmered with the unmistakable skill of a sophisticated hand. And yet, by our historical timelines, such metallurgy shouldn't have existed in Neolithic Europe. The artifacts were sent to Romania's National History Museum. There was brief excitement, a few announcements, and then nothing. No exhibitions, no peer-reviewed studies, no official publications. The silence lasted 7 years. Then, in 2015, Elena Niculai, a former museum conservator, broke ranks. She had worked closely with the artifacts from 2008 to 2014. In a quietly published article, she revealed that the museum had deliberately withheld the findings. Her claim was simple but troubling. The metallurgy was too advanced. Laboratory tests showed evidence of alloying, gold mixed intentionally with trace metals to alter strength and color. Some pieces exhibited signs of annealing, a complex process of heating and cooling that requires deep understanding of materials. According to Niculai, museum officials feared that releasing the findings would attract fringe theorists or inspire speculation about lost civilizations. But beneath that concern lay something more institutional, a desire to preserve the accepted timeline of technological development in Europe. In the dominant narrative, Neolithic Europe was primitive. Farming had only just begun to take root. Societies were tribal. Complex metalworking wasn't supposed to appear for another 2,000 years. Yet here was gold, not only worked, but mastered. Niculai prepared detailed reports, but she was told by senior curators that publication would be delayed indefinitely. When she pressed further, a colleague confided, the museum feared becoming the center of controversial theories. Better, they believed, to keep the artifacts in restricted storage, out of sight, out of debate. She left the museum not long after. To this day, the Romanian gold remains in archival drawers, officially unremarkable. Requests to study the pieces are routinely denied. No full analysis has been released. We don't know who made them. We don't know how such knowledge existed at such an early date. And we may never know, because the truth, in this case, is locked away not by mystery, but by caution. Niculai's story is a reminder that archaeology is not just a science of discovery. It's also a science of permission. Who decides what gets studied, what gets published, what gets forgotten, and what happens to knowledge when its very existence becomes inconvenient? In the Romanian hills, under the shadow of silence, ancient gold waits, not for time, but for the courage to ask what it truly means. Beneath the heart of Mexico City lies a secret the ground itself tried to keep. In 1978, electrical workers digging downtown accidentally uncovered the remains of the Templo Mayor, the main ceremonial temple of the ancient Aztecs. What followed was one of the most significant archaeological undertakings in modern Mexican history. Excavations revealed massive altars, ceremonial platforms, and thousands of artifacts. The site became an open-air museum, a tribute to the cultural heart of a lost empire. But not everything found was displayed. In 1982, during one phase of the dig, archaeologists opened a chamber beneath the main altar. What they found, according to later accounts, would never be seen by the public. Officially, this part of the excavation was sealed due to concerns about structural stability. But in 2009, archaeologist Dr. Rosa Guerrero, who had worked on the team from 1979 to 1984, published a memoir revealing a different story. Inside that sealed chamber, she claimed, were artifacts that did not match known Aztec craftsmanship. There were stone tablets inscribed with unfamiliar symbols, possibly Phoenician or Egyptian in origin. There were items crafted from materials not native to Mesoamerica, including metal objects with a composition unlike anything produced in pre-Columbian Mexico. Guerrero described these items as confusing, even disturbing. They suggested the possibility of contact, however fleeting, between the Aztecs and transoceanic cultures long before the arrival of the Spanish. Such a suggestion was, and still is, considered fringe. When the findings were reported to Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History, INAH, the response was immediate and final. The chamber was ordered sealed. Concrete was poured. The official reason was structural integrity. Unofficially, Guerrero said, team members were told the artifacts were problematic and could become ammunition for pseudo-archaeologists. No photographs were released. No catalog was published. And today, the sealed section remains off-limits, encased in stone and silence. Guerrero's memoir was met with skepticism. No other team member has publicly confirmed her account. But the sudden halt of a major excavation in its most sensitive area remains curious. Why would a government stop a discovery of this magnitude? One answer may lie in the tension between academic caution and national identity. Mexican archaeology has fought hard to preserve and elevate the heritage of its indigenous civilizations. A claim of foreign influence, especially one from across the Atlantic, could appear to diminish that legacy. But Guerrero argued the opposite. Acknowledging possible early contact wouldn't undermine the Aztec story. It would deepen it. Complexity doesn't erase culture, it enriches it. Instead, the site was closed, not by time, but by policy. In the shadows beneath Mexico City, where gods were once honored with fire and song, a vault lies forgotten. If Guerrero was right, it holds objects that tell a different story, one of shared seas, lost roots, and impossible meetings. And perhaps that's why it was sealed. Not because it wasn't real, but because it was too real to handle. In the ancient lands of Australia, where the red earth remembers stories far older than history books record, a quiet mystery unfolded in 2006. Dr. Stephen Strong, a geologist by training, was called to examine a series of stone arrangements in New South Wales. The local Aboriginal elders believed the stones were placed by their ancestors, part of sacred songlines passed down through generations. To the untrained eye, the site appeared simple, just stones, scattered, sun-bleached, silent. But Strong saw something else. The stones were not local to the area. They had been transported. Some were aligned with astronomical patterns. Many bore signs of deliberate shaping, pecked, smoothed, positioned with a clear sense of purpose, using geological weathering analysis and dating methods tied to lichen growth. Strong estimated the formations to be at least 10,000 years old, possibly older. That changed everything. Conventional archaeology portrayed Aboriginal Australians as primarily nomadic hunter-gatherers during that period, without permanent structures or complex architecture. But here, in the stones, was a different narrative, one of sophisticated cultural expression and environmental mastery, long before the pyramids or Stonehenge. Strong was eager to publish. He prepared academic reports, consulted with journals, but before he could submit, he received a letter from the Office of Environment and Heritage. It warned that his research violated heritage protection laws, citing a lack of proper permits. He was threatened with legal action and ordered to cease all work. The message was clear. walk away. Strong, unwilling to risk a legal battle he couldn't afford, complied. He left academia. In 2014, he published his findings online, beyond the reach of institutional censors. He didn't stop there. In interviews and writings, he described a broader pattern of researchers encountering ancient Aboriginal sites only to be silenced through bureaucracy. He claimed that certain discoveries were quietly discouraged because they could bolster Aboriginal land and resource rights. If proven that Aboriginal peoples had built and maintained sophisticated sites for tens of thousands of years, it could reshape modern legal and political landscapes. The implications reached far beyond science. His claims remain controversial. Government agencies argue that heritage laws exist to protect sacred sites from disturbance, and they're right, to a point. But Strong's testimony and those of other researchers and Aboriginal elders suggest a deeper issue, a reluctance to acknowledge just how ancient and how advanced Aboriginal cultures truly were, in a nation still grappling with the legacy of colonization. Admitting that Australia's first peoples may have built ceremonial stone structures 10,000 years ago is more than an academic shift. It's a cultural reckoning. Today, the stone sites remain largely unstudied, unprotected, and officially unacknowledged. But to those who walk the land with listening hearts, their message endures. The stones whisper a truth older than maps or empires. That the past is not a straight line, but a song, sung across millennia, waiting for those willing to hear beyond the silence. In the parched hills near the Dead Sea, a Bedouin shepherd stumbled into a cave in 1947, changing biblical scholarship forever. Inside, rolled into ancient jars, were fragments of scrolls written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, texts lost for nearly 2 millennia. Over the next decade, thousands more pieces were discovered, many forming what we now call the Dead Sea Scrolls. They included the earliest known versions of Old Testament books, along with apocryphal writings, sectarian rules, and philosophical reflections. Most of the scrolls were eventually published and made available to scholars, but not all. For decades, a small group of academics tightly controlled access to thousands of tiny, fragmented pieces. Critics accused them of hoarding the material, delaying publication to maintain prestige, or to suppress controversial content. In 1991, after unauthorized photographs leaked to the public, pressure mounted, the monopoly was broken, many remaining fragments were finally published. But not everything surfaced. In 2009, Yuval Pleg, a former curator at the Israel Museum's Shrine of the Book, quietly published an article. In it, he made a startling claim. During his time cataloging Dead Sea materials in the late 1990s, he came across several fragments that later vanished. One fragment, he said, appeared to contain an alternative version of the Book of Deuteronomy. The laws written there differed from the standard biblical text, new commandments, unfamiliar formulations. Another fragment painted the figure of Joshua, not as a warrior leading violent conquest, but as a negotiator forging peaceful agreements with Canaanite tribes. These weren't minor variations. They challenged core narratives in Judeo-Christian tradition. And when Pleg raised the issue, senior scholars told him the fragments were being sent for verification. He never saw them again. When he followed up, he was told the pieces were sent to off-site labs, but they never reappeared in reports or catalogs. They had, he said, simply vanished. The implication was subtle but powerful. Certain texts, if made public, could undermine theological interpretations that have guided billions of believers. They could shift the perceived fixity of sacred scripture, revealing it as a more fluid, evolving tradition than many institutions would prefer to admit. Pleg wasn't alone in his concerns. Other scholars have pointed to the decades-long delay in publication as a red flag. Why keep documents of such significance under wraps for so long? The standard explanation, lack of resources, complex restoration work, only explains part of the silence. Religion and archaeology are uneasy partners. Where one seeks divine constancy, the other uncovers change. And in the case of the Dead Sea Scrolls, that tension remains unresolved. Today, most of the scrolls have been digitized and shared. But Plague's missing fragments have never been recovered or acknowledged. The museum has never officially responded to his claims. So we are left with another silence, less ancient, more deliberate. In it lies a profound question. If sacred texts contain multitudes, do we honor the fullness of that history, or do we edit it for the sake of comfort? Perhaps the greatest scrolls are not the ones we've found, but the ones we weren't allowed to read. At the edge of ancient memory and modern disbelief lies a story wrapped in snow, ice, and silence. Antarctica, a continent of extremes, seemingly untouched by the footprints of human antiquity, holds within its frozen heart a question we have barely begun to ask. And it begins with a map. The Peary Race map, drawn in 1513, inexplicably shows Antarctica's coastline, accurately, and most unsettling of all, without its covering of ice. But that mystery, already stretching the limits of historical explanation, deepened decades later with a testimony that came not from a historian, but from a retired U.S. Navy officer. In 2018, under a pseudonym, he shared his account of a classified mission to Antarctica in the mid-1980s. His team had been part of a radar mapping operation near Queen Maud Land, the very coastline depicted on the Peary Reese map. Using ground-penetrating radar and sonar, they discovered geometric patterns beneath the ice. Perfectly straight lines, right angles, and grid-like structures buried thousands of feet below. To them, it looked artificial. When the findings were reported to command, they were met not with excitement, but orders. Cease all further investigation. Mark the coordinates, seal the data, and speak no further of what had been found. Each team member was debriefed and required to sign non-disclosure agreements. The radar images were classified, the data shelved indefinitely. Later, the officer learned that analysts had quietly compared the team's coordinates to ancient maps, including the Peary Race. The structures they detected lined up precisely with regions portrayed centuries before Antarctica was officially discovered. That connection raised too many uncomfortable questions. Who mapped Antarctica before it was covered in ice? Who built anything there, and when? If the continent had once been habitable, even home to advanced life, then our understanding of Earth's recent history, of climate, civilization, and technological capability, would require radical revision. The implications were staggering. So staggering, in fact, that the safest course of action was to bury the evidence as deeply as the ice itself. The U.S. Navy has never confirmed the officer's story. No documentation has surfaced, but the idea that ancient cartography and modern classified data might converge beneath Antarctica's silence has stirred imaginations and unease in equal measure. Most historians still dismiss the Peary Race map as misunderstood, its outlines coincidental. Most scientists consider tales of Antarctic structures speculative at best. Yet the radar scans, if they exist, remain locked away. And the land beneath the ice, vast, uncharted, and mostly unexplored, holds its secrets well. Sometimes the past isn't hidden because we haven't found it. It's hidden because someone already has, and chose not to tell the rest of us. Beneath 3 miles of ice, the Earth keeps its oldest secrets. And maybe, just maybe, we've already heard their echo, only to turn away. In the fading light of history, there are moments when truth sits just beyond reach, not because we lack the tools to grasp it, but because we're told not to try. One such moment happened in Romania, and another, far from Europe, unfolded in a small, sacred chamber beneath the sands of the Middle East. But this final chapter takes us into a different kind of silence, a modern one. It speaks not of ancient temples or forgotten maps, or shishukur to Donamhas, but of fragile scrolls and institutional control. The Dead Sea Scrolls, as we've seen, are perhaps the most important biblical archaeological discovery of the 20th century. But even as most of their contents were shared with the world, the smallest pieces, the thousands of tiny fragmented shards, remained in the hands of a very small circle of scholars. Then, in 2009, a man named Yuval Pleg stepped forward. Pleg had served as a curator at Israel's Shrine of the Book, the wing of the Israel Museum dedicated to preserving and displaying the scrolls. During his years there, he handled and cataloged fragments, some so small they were barely legible, but a few stood out. He described several pieces that diverged significantly from the canonical biblical texts. One fragment seemed to recount a version of Deuteronomy with alternate laws, commands absent from the version passed down through religious tradition. Another depicted Joshua not as a fierce military leader, but as a diplomatic negotiator. These weren't editorial tweaks, they were narrative reversals. When Pleg flagged them for further study, he was told they would be authenticated and stored for preservation. Then they disappeared. They weren't published. They weren't included in later museum inventories. They simply vanished from the record. Pleg later wrote that he believed these fragments were suppressed, not because they were fakes, but because they were real. Their content was simply too disruptive, too complicated, too likely to provoke theological controversy. Religious institutions, both in Israel and abroad, have vested interest in preserving the perceived continuity and authority of scriptural tradition. Textual variations, even those written thousands of years ago, threaten that narrative. And so the decision was made not to challenge faith, but to protect it. But in doing so, something sacred was lost. Pleg's revelations were met with predictable resistance. No formal investigation was launched. The museum offered no public comment. And those fragments, if they still exist, remain hidden. Their insights withheld, not by decay or time, but by human judgment. It raises a difficult question. Who gets to decide which parts of our shared history are worth knowing? When science, faith, and politics collide, it is often the evidence that suffers. And so we are left with stories whispered from the margins, testimonies of discoveries made, then buried, evidence seen, then sealed. The Dead Sea Scrolls were once hidden in desert caves. Now, some of their truths may be hidden again, this time behind institutional walls. And perhaps that's the quiet tragedy of modern archaeology. Not that we haven't found the answers, but that we did and walked away. The past is not dead. It isn't even past. We like to think of history as a stable map, dates, places, events etched in certainty. But more often, it's a shifting tide, shaped by those who choose what to preserve and what to conceal. As we've seen across these stories, from the Grand Canyon to the Gulf of Kampat, from desert vaults to ice-locked frontiers, some of the most extraordinary discoveries didn't disappear with time. They were hidden, not by accident, not by nature, but by human hands. And what's most unsettling is that these hands weren't malicious. They belong to institutions we trust, museums, universities, governments, scientific bodies. Their motivations weren't always nefarious. Sometimes they were practical. A discovery challenged political stability. Another risked religious discord. A third threatened to empower fringe theories or invite unwanted attention. In many cases, the people who came forward, the warehouse clerk, the retired archaeologist, the quiet museum conservator, did so not to cause chaos, but to restore balance. To say, this was found, and it matters. They didn't want fame. Some were dying, others had lost careers. All of them spoke from a place of conviction. Not because they knew all the answers, but because they believed we deserve to ask better questions. If history is a mirror, what does it reflect when we've covered half of it with a cloth? We are not suggesting that every unverified claim is true, or that every artifact points to a lost civilization. What this journey reveals is something more nuanced, and perhaps more disturbing. That archaeology, like all human enterprise, is subject to fear, ego, and control. When discoveries threaten the structure of accepted knowledge, the response is often not curiosity, but containment. We build museums to showcase the past, but we also build vaults. So what else lies hidden? How many mummies remain sealed in crates beneath national institutions? How many underwater cities sleep undisturbed because politics make excavation too complicated? How many scrolls, tablets, and relics remain cataloged under unclassified purpose, not because we don't understand them, but because we don't want to? We like to say that truth always comes to light, but that's only true when someone chooses to lift the curtain. And as long as knowledge is subject to institutional permission, truth itself remains negotiable. So the question isn't whether these archaeological cover-ups prove alternative histories. The question is, who gets to decide which histories are even allowed to be explored? Maybe, just maybe, it's time to move beyond fear, to let the evidence speak, even when it challenges our assumptions. To create a culture of inquiry that values wonder over comfort, because the past isn't just a record of what was, it's a guide to who we are and who we might still become, and it deserves to be seen, not silenced.